Hello, today I am reviewing the Venus. This is a Lethal Gamer's take on a hybrid type mousepad that's still fairly speedy, but a little bit more balanced than usual. Thank you to them for sending it out, and for reference, this white piece of paper here is only because my camera gets a little bit overexposed if I don't have enough light. So, like all hybrid pads, this is made out of a synthetic material that has a somewhat plasticky feel, and the surface has a little bit of texture to it as well. Using synthetic fibers helps these pads to feel very consistent and resistant to a wide variety of weather conditions. This will not be affected nearly as much as a traditional cloth surface, which I really appreciate. But what differentiates it from some of the other hybrid surfaces is that the Venus is a little bit smoother. It is still slightly abrasive, so you do get the feedback and tactility that is so good about these types of pads, but it is not nearly as harsh, and should be much more comfortable in some of the worst offenders. Of course, you still do not get as much tactility, because with that extra roughness on your skin does come extra feedback, but I could definitely see a trade-off being worth it for a more comfortable surface. Also, unlike some of these other hybrid pads, the Venus creates a little bit more friction to feel more controlled. It still does have very low static friction, and it is quite easy to get your mouse moving from a complete standstill, so it does too well to facilitate small, precise movements in your aim. Especially when you combine it with that textural feedback that I was talking about earlier, it does feel very good and very precise for these small movements. If you are someone that does incorporate your fingers and your hand into your aim a lot, and you like these types of movements feeling precise, this is a pad that should be perfect for you. This extra dynamic friction also helps us slow down the pad a little bit to the point where it feels like more of an in-between spot between hybrid and control surfaces. It still definitely leans towards speed, but I would not say that it is a fast pad at all. It is probably a little bit slower than you think, so it could function as a good onboard point for someone who is used to these controlled surfaces but would like to learn this more manual microcorrection style. If you are someone coming from a controlled surface, this would probably be my top hybrid pad recommendation. This extra dynamic friction also allows it to keep a pretty good amount of stopping power, so it does still feel quite controllable. This does help make an otherwise somewhat speedy feeling pad still quite viable for slower paced games. It is definitely less optimal because this lack of static friction does introduce a little bit of instability that can harm your play in something like a tack shooter that requires you to be very locked in and very precise at all times. But the extra stopping power and just general feeling of controllability should help a lot and make it still feel quite good for these slower style of games. I still would recommend a control pad with a little higher friction for these games, but again, this is probably the top recommendation of this category. Now, just like the rest of Lethal's lineup, the Venus is very value focused. And for only $30, it offers a pretty good experience. The surface does feel high quality and durable, so it does have a little bit of that premium feel. And then the stitching is almost level to the pad and is very soft on your arm. You can still feel a little bit of bump when you start to move your mouse over the edge, but on your arm it's completely comfortable and I don't think you should have any issues. It is also quite thick and heavy, which once again just helps it feel a little bit more premium and give it a squish that can make it slightly more comfortable. But there is definitely some areas that could be improved. For example, the stitching, while comfortable and still pretty high quality, is a little bit inconsistent in places. Like in the upper left corner here, I have a little bit of fraying that came right out of the box. Then in the bottom right, the stitching had a little bit of an error where it ended up crimping the surface up a little bit. And in this very bottom corner, it doesn't quite lay flat, and there is a very visible bump right here on the stitching. And even after a couple weeks out of the box and on my desk, it still has not laid completely flat in this area here. It doesn't actually bother me because it is only very minorly raised, but I still would prefer a completely flat surface. All of their pads come in extremely large boxes and are loosely rolled, so I was pretty surprised to see this issue. Then finally, the rubber base is somewhat mediocre. It is just your super generic patterned rubber backing, so it doesn't quite grab to your desk surface as I would like, and I do notice a little bit of drifting at the end of sessions. It still isn't as bad as a lot of other pads though, because you don't actually notice it moving around while playing, but in between matches I will have to shift my pad down a little bit to realign it at the bottom of my desk, which is just a little bit annoying. Still though, all things considered, for $30 this pad is pretty decent. It certainly lacks that ultra premium next level feel, but you aren't paying anywhere near a premium price, so it washes out to me. And when you combine this decent quality with a good surface, it makes the Venus a pretty easy recommendation to make. The pad doesn't really do anything too special, and it is just a slightly different take on the classic hybrid surface, and it's not going to be completely universal because it is still somewhat speedy, but when you start to consider the whole package, it definitely does have a lot going for it. And anyone that likes these style of surfaces should absolutely check it out. You just can't really go wrong, I feel, and these types of surfaces are quite popular, so I'm sure that a lot of people will like this pad. Alright, now that I've finished the general overview of the pad, I want to go more in detail into what the surface feels like in game. Because while this is still a pretty safe take on the hybrid formula, and most people will be totally fine with this pad, it is still a unique surface, so you gotta be sure if it could work out for you before you make a purchase. So the place where I want to start here is with the actual weave itself. Like I said before, the fibers are synthetic and they have a pretty distinctive, hard, somewhat plastic feeling. This is very typical of these textured hybrid surfaces, and it is not quite the most comfortable. I was able to get used to this pad in particular because it isn't quite rough, more abrasive, so it was not particularly harsh compared to some other pads, but I have been using a lot of very smooth cloth surfaces recently, so there was a bit of an adjustment period, and especially when I was using something like the M2K, where a very large amount of my hand touches the pad, I was a little bit uncomfortable for a couple of days. But I feel this lack of comfort is almost always worth it for these synthetic surfaces, because they always perform quite well. These types of pads start to take on very unique qualities, and in particular, I feel that they work very well for glass feet. Like if you use Lethal Gamer's own feet, this should be a pad that you look out for, because it definitely has that synthetic feel that is highly compatible for these types of skates. These plasticky fibers are also water resistant, so it should be pretty resilient in a variety of weather conditions. The base of these pads are still pretty spongy, so when you put water on it, it does soak in the surface a little bit, but it does not actually affect the glide that much, and this is a very extreme example, so you should be totally fine no matter what. Now the weave pattern, how these fibers are actually put together, is very tight. They're all quite close together and form a somewhat wavy pattern that you can see here. Of course, the wavy pattern isn't nearly as prevalent as it is on the Ayateotsu, but I think they were trying to imitate a little bit of the surface's pattern. There are some definite similarities. So because the weave is so close together, there's not actually that much depth in the pattern. The surface is relatively flat and you don't quite feel the peaks and valleys like you do on some other hybrid pads like the Kian, Exxon Control, or anything else that has a much more prevalent roughness. This, I think, is what mainly makes the Venus a little bit smoother than some of these other pads. It still definitely does have all the abrasiveness, but doesn't quite have the depth that can start to make these other pads feel distinctively rough. Therefore, you don't quite get the feeling of experiencing each of the individual bumps in the texture, and instead all of your feedback is just the vague abrasiveness of your mouse rubbing up against the very top of each of these little tiny bumps. When you start to use these rougher pads, you can instead feel your mouse going over each individual bump one at a time. This is definitely something that I personally prefer, and I really like this feeling, because it does feel it adds just that next level of precision when you can almost start to subconsciously counting the amount of dots that you go over. But while the Venus does like that individual bump feeling, the abrasiveness does give a good amount of feedback that keeps the pad feeling responsive and tight. Also, I should note that some of the abrasiveness smooths out a little bit with use, so there is a bit of a break-in period on the Venus. It feels like a tiny bit off the tops of the bumps ends up rubbing away with use. And over time, after about a week and so I'd probably say, it becomes less harsh and slightly smoother. So you should definitely expect this pad to change slightly with more extended use. For example, if you use something like the Kian before, this break-in period will be similar, but much less severe. It does the same exact thing where it becomes less sharp with use, and it also gains a little bit of static friction because it feels like your mouse doesn't quite sit as high because the bumps start to rub down a little bit and it starts to rub against the pad more. But as opposed to the Kian, the Venus actually speeds up slightly on these larger movements. It feels like the smoother surface ends up grabbing your feet a little bit less and giving you a more glidey feeling. But once again, all these changes are very subtle and it is not a huge difference. Personally, I only thought that the pad started feeling a little bit different over time because I was getting used to it, and I only actually noticed that it was a distinctive break-in period when I started testing different areas that I did not use as less. Because in these areas, I do notice a slightly higher amount of friction, and most importantly, a very slightly smoother texture. But just using it normally, it felt exactly like an adjustment period, so all these changes are very minor. And also, this doesn't really raise any durability concerns, because I only noticed it changing in about the first week, and in the next two following, it felt exactly the same, so I assumed that it should keep this feel for a very long time. This pad does feel high quality and quite durable. So, the next big bonus of all hybrid pads is a very low static friction and a small amount of resistance on these inner hand small motions. In the Venus's case specifically, it feels like your mouse sits on top of this small abrasive texture, so it's very easy to get your mouse moving and it doesn't quite feel like you're dragging when it is moving from a standstill. There is still a little bit of static friction, especially once you break it in, so the pad doesn't actually feel slippery and you still have a tiny bit of stability. This definitely does help a lot for slower paced games like tack shooters. And like I said earlier, I definitely think that this pad is viable for those types of games. You do get a little bit of stability that helps lock in your crosshair placement and remove a tiny bit of some of the jitters that you may have. But I still think that people who are used to cloth-controlled surfaces will feel very shaky with this at first. It certainly has far less static friction and far less stability than any control pad I've tried, which is pads like the PA or the Odin Eclipse are still my top recommendations for these games. I feel that most people, even the ones with very good mouse control, will greatly appreciate the extra stability that relatively high static friction can provide. So before you get this pad for a slower paced game, you have to be sure that you are confident in your ability to be controlled and stable without a high amount of static friction to help you along and sort of carry you. But again, if you are open to this manual control and manual stability, it should still be great for you because this pad is very viable for these click timing heavy games because of the low resistance on these small inner hand motions. It is super easy to incorporate your hand and your fingers into your aim when you're not fighting against the pad like you will on some of these higher static friction surfaces. And on the Venus, it always just has this slight tug that helps to keep you feeling locked in and help you make very consistent, precise correction movements. For example, this was the pad that I set my new record on 1-6 target small in Kovacs with. It feels very good for the style of aim where you have to make fast corrections because the low resistance allows you to move your mouse very quickly. But you aren't really sacrificing much of the precision because you still have that little bit of tug to give you some stopping power, but not enough to feel restrictive and nerve your mouse control. This little bit of tug you feel from dynamic friction also adds a pretty decent amount of stopping power on some of these large motions as well. It still isn't a lot because this pad isn't that heavily textured, and pads that are more rough will have a similar amount of stopping power despite a relatively faster glide. And of course this pad still does feel fairly quick, so it's not going to be as much stopping power as an actual control pad. But it still does add just enough to make it feel controllable. And once you get used to it, I think it'll have a pretty satisfactory amount of stopping power, especially for a pad that excels as much as this does on the small motions. It's just feeling of dynamic friction does make the Venus feel pretty unique amongst the hybrid category, because when your mouse starts moving, it feels much more like you're rubbing against the surface than normal. It feels like your mouse stops floating on top of the texture like I was talking about earlier, and instead you start to rub against the pad more like a traditional surface. This right here, where you stop floating and start rubbing, is where the tug starts to come into play. And this little bit of tug that you start to feel in the Venus is what starts to make this pad a little bit more of a bridge between these hybrid type fast surfaces and some of the more middle of the road control pads. This constant tug is also how the Venus differentiates itself from its closest competitor, the Hayateotsu. Both these pads do have a similar objective of creating a more balanced hybrid surfaces, so they are fairly similar in practice. But there are definitely big differences in how they feel. Although here I should mention that my personal Hayateotsu is an extra soft, and I have heard that the Venus is most similar to the mid, so keep that in mind. Anyway, on the Hayateotsu, this pad always has that floaty feeling I was talking about on the Venus's static movements. This pad always feels like you're using a cloud. It is incredible how floaty it feels. This is how it gets its ultra premium and truly exotic feel. So instead of getting all of its stopping power from a constant tug of dynamic friction, the Hayateotsu instead relies on its very fine texture from its extremely wavy pattern. This allows your mouse to float very effortlessly across the surface until you want it to stop, then the texture grabs it and breaks your mouse immediately. So it stays so responsive and stops immediately right once you want it to, despite it being constantly floaty. Then the Venus, in comparison, has a much more consistent feeling of dynamic friction, and it always has much more of a tug that is very constant. This does make it feel a little bit slower and not quite as quick or snappy feeling, but I personally feel that this also adds a lot of consistency, because it is much easier to learn a more constant tug, and I do feel that the much more snappy aiming style on the Hayateotsu definitely lends itself to being more inconsistent for me personally. And then finally, this very consistent tug is also more bland, so it definitely doesn't have that exotic feel of the Hayateotsu. And then finally, like I've been saying, this noticeable dynamic friction does make this pad a little bit slower than you probably think it is. Its friction is definitely much more so than other hybrids I have tried that feel similar in their surfaces. So this is definitely not for people that want a completely effortless feeling glide. Instead, it's a little bit more of a balance between speed and control. Of course, this phrase is by now a complete cliche and has lost all meaning, but I do think that it does specifically apply to this pad. Just keep in mind that it's still fairly quick and leans towards speed instead of control. But how it sits in this more balanced category does help it to be a good gateway to get into faster pads, I feel. For people who are used to more controlled cloth surfaces, this higher dynamic friction will feel far more comfortable and prevent them from feeling slippery like some of those surfaces might do. This helps give you a little bit of that feeling of control they would probably otherwise miss, and also keeps it relatively locked in feeling. Although it will feel much more locked in on these small motions, so it could help acclimate you to this feeling of manual control and correction heavy focus. This can be something that is difficult to adapt to and takes a little bit of time to learn, because it is definitely hard to break the habit of crunching on your mouse pad to add the extra stability and really lock you in when you start incorporating your fingers. But on this pad, because it does have a little bit more dynamic friction, it can help ease you into it, as opposed to just dropping you off in the deep end like a much faster pad would. Plus, I also think that this manual control style should be something that everybody learns, because it will just objectively improve your aim when you can start to apply the style even to different pads. So I highly recommend that you look into surfaces like these and start to use them as a training tool. Once you start to learn how to control faster surfaces, the results will be immediate, trust me. So in conclusion, the Venus is a pretty solid pad. It is a pretty interesting take on a more balanced hybrid surface, and I do believe that it is a great option for people who do like these types of surfaces, or for those who are willing to learn them. Of course, it doesn't do anything super unique though, because it is just a riff on a type of surface that is very saturated right now, so you probably shouldn't get your hopes up for anything too insane. But if you do temper your expectations a little bit, this should be a great pad that I could easily recommend. Lethal Game Maker definitely brought the heat with this pad and the Saturn. The other two, the Mercury and the Jupiter, are much less impressive to me personally, but Venus Saturn, both easy recommendations. They really did a great job with these. I can't wait to see what they come up with next. Please, I'm begging you, textured control surface. That would be perfect. Next up on the channel, I will be re-reviewing the M2K. I've been putting a lot more time on it and want to give some more refined thoughts, especially now that I'm a much better reviewer after making my first video. Also, I'll be posting a roundup of some of my favorite control pads. I was going to do an all-encompassing top mouse pads roundup, but I found it very hard to delineate between speed and control surfaces for what I prefer more, because they really both do just such different things and perform so differently in game, that it really was hard to rank them all in one list. So instead, I'll be focusing on control surfaces that I perform the most consistently on. I would love to see all those ones, and thank you for watching.